The handheld gaming market is an ever-growing industry that's becoming increasingly impressive. Go back 4 years ago, the Switch was released, and that truly showed us the potential that handheld gaming will have in store for us in the future. Nowadays, we have the likes of the Ion Neo, GPD Win 3, and the Alienware UFO being released, creating a brand new console war. But which console is actually the best one when it comes down to it? Let's take a look. First and foremost, the specs are a fantastic teller of a console's power capabilities. All three devices have similar specs. On one hand, you got the Ion Neo and UFO, which are on the larger side, so it can fit more inside, of course. Then on the other is the Win 3, which is a mere 5.5-inch screen and is generally a fair bit more compact. However, despite the compactness of it, it actually packs a lot bigger punch than you might have thought. There are two models, one that rocks an 11th gen Intel Core i5 and one that rocks an i7. For clarification, for such a small console to have an 11th gen i7 is nothing short of miraculous. Pair that with the 16 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM and 1 terabyte of SSD space, and you got a console that could trump a lot of gaming laptops. In the very least, it'll be a remarkably fast device, although the graphics card is not incredible since it's only an Intel Iris X3, which is fairly entry-level stuff. Although I would argue that's actually a good thing because the screen is small and only reaches 720p, so a killer GPU would be unnecessary and costly. So overall, it's tanky handheld. But is it better than the Ion Neo? Well, the Neo rocks a 6-core AMD Ryzen 5 4500U, which is not Intel, obviously, but it is still pretty good. Compared to the Intel i7 inside the Win 3, is actually around 45% less powerful. In terms of RAM and storage, well, the Neo has 16 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM, much like the Win 3, and it also has 512 gigabytes of SSD storage space. Now you can see in raw specs the Ion Neo is inferior, even when you factor in the Neo's Radeon Vega 6 graphics card because, again, the screen is too small and only reaches a bit over standard definition, so the graphics are always going to be pretty limited regardless of what GPU is inside. The interesting thing about the Neo being less powerful than the Win 3 is that the Neo is actually about 2.5 inches bigger, so you'd think better hardware would be in it, but I guess not. However, while the Neo does seem inferior on paper, there are other strengths that it plays to, but I'll go on about that later. Taking a look at the UFO by Alienware. Well, firstly, it's an odd question of if, because there's no telling whether it will ever get released, and as such, we don't know the full specs. But what we do know though is that it has a 10th gen Intel, likely to be an i7, but there's no telling what it would specifically be. That CPU is fine and all, but where it would rule over the other two handhelds is that it's gonna sport a giant 8-inch screen that's a little over HD. That effectively means the GPU and the rest of the hardware would have to be somewhat meatier, so it's likely to be very powerful. Whether its performance would come close to that of the GPD Win 3 is a difficult question, but equally, the UFO plays to a completely different goal to the Win, because it's more of a ramped-up Nintendo Switch than a downright handheld device like the Neo and Win 3 are. Okay, so where each of these three handhelds really stand out from each other is the design and functions. Firstly, you got the GPD Win 3, which is a pretty small device, more aimed at portability than usability. Though that's not to say it's unusable because it is still ergonomic. Oh, and the screen is 5.5 inches. The Neo is the mid-range device that has a 7-inch screen. Then there's the UFO, which is 8 inches. And starting with the UFO, because it is the most unique of the three, it has clearly taken entirely after the Nintendo Switch with its detachable Joy-Cons and docking systems. Although interestingly, unlike the Switch, the UFO can connect to 3 screens at one time via the dock, which is super nifty for co-op, so that right there is an enormous reason for why someone would want to buy it. Unfortunately, the large size of the device does make it somewhat awkward to take around because it won't fit in your pocket, and it's going to be uncomfortably heavy. Having said that though, it is better for at-home play, so I can't complain too much on that front. The The GPD Win 3 is a whole other story though, because that certainly does not have any kind of detachable Joy-Cons or docking system. There's no doubt in my mind that the creators aim to create a full-fledged portable device. It can, of course, connect up to a larger screen using either the USB-C port or the HDMI 2.0 port on the compact docking device it comes with when the time comes for a more traditional gaming experience. But what really grabs my attention when it comes to the Win 3's quirks has to be the keyboard that sits behind the screen when slid up, because it opens a whole new tactic and makes operating the Windows 10 user interface just that bit more intuitive. That's something neither the UFO or the Neo has. However, where the Aya Neo does kinda take the spotlight is its 3 USB Type-C ports, 2 of which have video output and charging capabilities. This means you can connect the device up to 2 screens without the use of a dock, but with the dock, and yes, it does have a dock as well, no surprises there, with the dock, it can actually connect up to 3 different screens, much like the UFO. So again, the co-op capability is there, but it's still not as conventional as the UFO since you will need separate controllers. I'll also point out the fact that the Neo has gyro controls, which is kinda good for some games, particularly racing games. But outside of that, it may just be a gimmick. So, what do you think? Let me know in the comments below, and like and subscribe.